It was a meeting that was supposed to last hours. It lasted 45 minutes. Late in 2025, behind closed doors in Washington, senior trade officials from the United States and Canada sat down to negotiate. The expectation was a standard diplomatic exchange. The reality was a breakdown. No joint statements, no handshakes for the press, no progress. When the doors opened, the silence was deafening, but what followed was loud enough to shake the foundations of the American agricultural sector. Immediately following that collapse, President Donald Trump publicly declared that the United States was preparing to impose what he described as very severe tariffs on fertilizer imports from Canada. Now, if you are watching this and thinking, fertilizer? That sounds like a boring industry story, I need you to pause. This is not a story about industrial chemicals. This is not a story about steel or aluminum or car parts, the usual targets we've seen in the last decade of trade wars. This is a story about food. At its core, this case is about one terrified question echoing through the markets. What happens when a trade war targets a resource that the United States cannot produce enough of, cannot replace quickly, and absolutely cannot survive without? In today's video, we are going to go beyond the angry headlines. We are going to look at the hard data and the legal reality behind this threat. I'm going to explain why this specific tariff threat is legally precarious, why the Supreme Court might be the only thing standing between farmers and bankruptcy, and most importantly, why this decision could permanently rewrite the cost of your weekly grocery bill. There is also a critical, underreported detail in the trade filings about how Canada is retaliating, not with anger, but with a strategic pivot to Asia that could leave American agriculture stranded for a generation. We'll get to that deep dive in a moment. I'm Daniel Kershaw, an independent legal and political journalist. I don't work for any political party, campaign, or lobby. I just follow the facts, the filings, and the law. The big question we need to answer today is this. In a political environment desperate for leverage, where is the line between a tough negotiating tactic and a policy that directly threatens the food security of the American people? To truly understand why this is happening now, we have to step back and look at the political chessboard of late 2025. It is a volatile time in Washington. If you look at the national surveys from this period, the administration is operating under immense strain. Approval ratings are hovering in the mid-30% range. That is a dangerous zone for any leader. But the specific reason why those numbers are low is what matters here. Voters aren't complaining about abstract foreign policy. They are complaining about the cost of living. Housing affordability is at a crisis point. Inflation management is facing widespread dissatisfaction, and food costs remain stubbornly high. Throughout the year, we saw off-cycle state and congressional elections send a very clear, mixed but generally unfavorable signal to the Republican Party in key agricultural regions. The message from the voter base was consistent: we are hurting economically. So why launch a new trade war now? Usually when an administration is facing inflation pressure, the last thing they do is impose tariffs, which are by definition a tax that raises prices. From a legal perspective, this move is even more puzzling. By late 2025, the imperial presidency approach to trade is facing a wall. Trade attorneys and policy analysts have been warning for months that the executive branch is encountering narrower limits on unilateral trade action. The legal landscape has shifted. Several earlier tariffs are facing renewed scrutiny in federal courts. There is a growing whisper in Washington policy circles that the Supreme Court of the United States is preparing to curtail the sweeping enforcement of tariffs based on vague national security claims. The judiciary is signaling that the era of the president treating trade policy as a blank check might be coming to an end. Against this backdrop of legal weakness and polling trouble, the financial markets reacted to the fertilizer threat with a specific type of skepticism. Financial commentators and traders revived a shorthand phrase that had circulated for years: Trump always chickens out. It's a cynical view, but it's based on data. Markets have seen a repeated pattern: an aggressive headline-grabbing tariff announcement, followed by market volatility, followed by a quiet pause, an exemption, or a partial reversal. This pattern creates chaos. It produces volatility without delivering stable policy direction. For commodity producers, especially in agriculture, it creates a risk that is impossible to hedge against. But here is where the story changes. While the markets were expecting another bluff, the reality of the supply chain suggests that even a threat in this specific sector can cause irreversible damage. Let's return to the fallout of that 45-minute meeting. The announcement was brief, but the specificity was chilling. The president raised the possibility of very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer exports. This marked a significant tactical shift. In previous cycles, the trade war focused on manufacturing, steel, aluminum, autos, technology components. Those disruptions hurt supply chains and corporate balance sheets, but they didn't directly touch the biological necessity of the American food system. The fertilizer threat changes that equation entirely. You need to understand the geology here to understand the politics. Fertilizer, specifically potash, is not a discretionary input. You can't choose not to use it if you want modern crop yields. It is a foundational input. And here is the statistic that should keep policymakers up at night. Roughly 8 out of every 10 tons of potash imported by the United States originates in one place, Saskatchewan, Canada. This is one of the highest single supplier dependencies in the entire global trade network. The United States is not self-sufficient in potash. We simply do not have the geological reserves or the active mine capacity to feed our own fields. A common counterargument I hear is, why don't we just make it here? If you look at the industry reality, that argument falls apart. Unlike building a semiconductor factory or an assembly plant, you cannot just spin up a potash mine. New mines require long development timelines, often a decade or more. They require complex environmental permitting. They require massive capital infrastructure and a large skilled labor force that does not currently exist at scale in the U.S. Agricultural economists have emphasized this repeatedly. The United States cannot turn on domestic potash output in response to short-term trade disruptions. The supply curve is rigid. You cannot fight geology with tariffs. As soon as the traders processed this reality, the futures markets went into a frenzy. Fertilizer-linked derivative pricing started reflecting a new political risk premium. But it didn't stop there. Forward contracts for corn, wheat, and soybeans absorbed additional volatility. Think about what that means. These price movements were not driven by a drought in the Midwest. They weren't driven by a war in Europe. They were driven entirely by a press conference in Washington. The tariff headlines alone were enough to inflate the future cost of food. But while the markets were panicking about price, something much more dangerous was happening behind the scenes in Ottawa. The Canadians weren't just worrying about tariffs. They were preparing a response that would hit the U.S. much harder than a simple retaliatory tax, and that response involves a permanent map change. This is the part of the story that isn't getting enough airtime on cable news. Facing this hostility, Canada decided to shift its strategy. Instead of begging for access to the U.S. market, they began accelerating a pivot to the Asia-Pacific. The transcript and trade data confirm that Canada is redirecting fertilizer exports toward high-growth markets in South and Southeast Asia. This aligns with structural global demand. Populations in Asia are growing, they need food, and therefore they need fertilizer. By anchoring these relationships now, Canada is doing something smart. They are diversifying. They are reducing their exposure to the volatility of Washington politics. From a legal and strategic perspective, this creates a massive paradox for the United States. Tariffs are supposed to be a tool of leverage. You squeeze the other country so they give you what you want. But fertilizer doesn't fit that model. Because the U.S. needs the product more than Canada needs the U.S. market, thanks to global demand, the tariffs risk exporting leverage instead of creating it. Each long-term contract Canada signs with a buyer in Vietnam, India, or Indonesia is a contract that isn't going to an American farmer. Even if the tariffs are dropped later, those Asian contracts are binding. The supply leaves the North American continent, and it doesn't come back easily. We have precedent for how painful this can get. If you remember the earlier phases of the trade war, retaliatory tariffs caused U.S. agricultural exports to plummet. To stop farmers from going under, the federal government had to deploy approximately $12 billion in direct farm aid. That episode demonstrated a core contradiction of this strategy. Tariffs impose economic strain that requires taxpayer-funded relief to offset. But in 2025, the margin for repeating that cycle is razor thin. Federal borrowing costs are materially higher than they were in the previous decade. The national debt is under pressure. The ability to just write a check for billions of dollars to farmers without triggering political backlash or further inflation is severely constrained. Let's make this personal. If you are a taxpayer, you are potentially getting hit twice. First, you get hit at the grocery store because tariffs on fertilizer eventually show up in the price of bread and meat. Second, you get hit on your tax bill, or through inflation caused by deficit spending, when the government has to bail out the agricultural sector. It is a negative feedback loop, and in an environment where voters are already citing cost of living as their primary concern, this is political suicide. The inflation environment further complicates relief efforts. Injecting new subsidies into an economy that is already struggling with food prices risks reinforcing price instability. This is the strategic environment in which fertilizer tariffs entered the conversation. Unlike earlier moves, this threat intersects directly with voter-sensitive inflation, food availability, and farm income. It transformed the trade war from a manufacturing conflict into a food system conflict. And once food enters the equation, the economic and political stakes rise sharply. If you are still watching, here is the deeper layer. This isn't just about the price of potash next month. It's about the credibility of American power in the late stages of a presidency. By the end of 2025, President Trump's political trajectory strongly resembles that of a lame duck leader. Legal pressure has intensified. Judicial scrutiny over tariff authority has deepened. When a president threatens tariffs early in a term, foreign countries listen because they know he has 4 years to enforce them. But late in a term, with low approval ratings and courts watching, trading partners start to assume optionality. They model not what tariffs are announced, but how long they are likely to survive past the next political transition. Canada's restraint is not passive, it is strategic. Ottawa does not need to defeat the tariff threat directly. It only needs to survive it politically. Time becomes their primary asset. Every month that passes without binding fertilizer tariffs weakens Washington's bargaining leverage. Every legal filing, every court delay, every public dissent within the U.S. policy community signals to the world that enforcement credibility is fragmenting. For the global economy, the fertilizer dispute is becoming a template for a new reality: supply chain decentralization. Instead of pulling production inward, which was the goal of America First, tariffs on foundational inputs are incentivizing outward redirection. Once the network decentralizes, once Canada builds the port capacity to ship to Asia, reaggregating that supply back to the U.S. becomes exceptionally difficult. This moment represents more than a tactical trade conflict. It marks the early stage of a structural realignment in North American food security. For decades, the United States operated under the assumption that domestic production was insulated from input coercion. Fertilizer tariffs break that assumption. Once essential nutrients become hostage to geopolitical friction, national food resilience inherits a vulnerability that cannot be walled off through monetary or fiscal tools alone. I have to be honest with you. When I read through these trade analysis reports, there is a sense of fatigue that comes off the page. Not just from the economists, but from the voters they study. People are tired. They are tired of the uncertainty. They are tired of wondering if a policy announcement on Tuesday will ruin their business on Wednesday. Most people don't have time to track global potash flows. They just want a system that works. They want to know that when they go to the store, the prices will be stable. And right now, these political games are stripping away that stability. Let's recap the 3 critical things we've uncovered in this file. First, the United States is threatening tariffs on a resource, fertilizer, that it is 80% dependent on Canada for. This is a geological reality that politics cannot fix. Second, the timing is terrible. With high inflation and a lame duck political status, the administration lacks the fiscal space to bail out farmers like it did in the past. Third, the unintended consequences already happening. Canada is pivoting to Asia, potentially cutting the U.S. out of the supply chain permanently. At its core, this situation forces us to confront a hard truth about the limits of power. Tariffs are often sold to the public as a weapon of strength, but the fertilizer case reveals how quickly they can become evidence of dependency. When you wage a trade war on the very inputs that feed your own people, you aren't fighting the enemy. You are fighting yourself. Legally speaking, this is a five-alarm fire for the rule of law and economic stability. It suggests a chaotic approach to governance where headlines matter more than outcomes. And for anyone who cares about the long-term security of this country, that should raise real concerns. I want to turn this over to you. If you are someone who pays taxes, worries about your mortgage, or runs a business, how do you feel about your economic stability being used as a bargaining chip in these late-term negotiations? Do you believe the U.S. should pursue energy and food independence at any cost, even if it means short-term inflation? Or is this trade war a bridge too far? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read them to understand what is actually happening on the ground away from Washington, and if you found this analysis useful, if you value understanding the why behind the what, please consider subscribing. We are going to keep tracking these court cases and trade deals no matter how complex they get. I'm Daniel Kershaw. Thank you for watching and stay informed.